Hi, this is Norm, and welcome to my video blog. This is my first, the next great experiment. I've been blogging on LinkedIn now for a couple of years, sharing my life experiences, my thoughts, my philosophies on leadership, on practice development, on communication skills. And I was about to do a blog on speaking when it occurred to me that it would be a little bit ironic to write about speaking. It would be a whole lot smarter to talk about speaking. So here I am, sharing my views on speaking. I know for many of you, getting up in public in front of a group, whether it's 2 people, 12 people, 30 people, is something that you consider to be quite intimidating and something you don't really want to do, and it makes you nervous. And believe it or not, we all start there. So I decided I was going to break this down into a series of learnings in terms of what makes good speakers good and great speakers great. So let's talk with what I consider to be probably the most critical thing you need to understand about speaking, and that is that great speaking is about great storytelling. Think about it. When you walk out of a speech, whether it's a couple of hours later or a couple of days later, a couple of weeks later, what facts do you remember about what you've heard? The answer is, and I know when it's me, when somebody says, okay, what did the speaker talk about? I have to actually think about it. It takes me a while to formulate my thoughts, and if I can remember even 2 things that jumped out of me from the speech, it's a lot. And why is that? I think the answer is actually not all that complicated. We tend not to be able to assimilate all the facts and information that a speaker has given us. However, we do walk out of a speech knowing whether we liked it or not. And we always walk out of a speech remembering how we feel. And if a speaker is able to move us, then we want to hear that speaker again. And we'll walk out and say, wow, that was an experience. Kind of ironic when you think about it, because ultimately, particularly when we're making presentations, we're trying to impart information to our colleagues. So it's kind of almost one thing working against the other, which is we feel a need to impart information, and yet we know that information isn't going to be received very well. And when somebody thinks about whether they've been bored to death in a presentation or whether they thought it was great, it's usually about whether at some level we've managed to touch them emotionally. So why is that? I think part of the answer, maybe not the entire answer, but certainly a major part of it has to do with storytelling. If we can tell a story that connects with our audience, then we'll have a meaningful experience with that listener. Let me give you an example. I want to talk to you about my Uncle Harry. Uncle Harry was not only my uncle, he was everyone's uncle. Uncle Harry was one of the most famous pediatricians in Montreal in his lifetime. He was also a great allergist, but I think everybody remembers Uncle Harry as, if you come from Montreal, you remember Uncle Harry as your pediatrician, because so many of us went to him. And when I think of Uncle Harry as a child, I remember a few things. One, the smell in his office when I walked in kind of smelled a bit like a hospital, antiseptic. And it's funny when you think about it, because when you go back to your early childhood memories, how many do you have? Not a lot. But the smell in Uncle Harry's office is one of them. Second thing I remember about Uncle Harry was he always walked around with a white lab coat, a stethoscope around his neck, and an unlit cigarette sort of hanging out of his mouth like that. The doctors told him he wasn't allowed to smoke, but he couldn't give up the oral fixation. So didn't matter what time of day it was, Uncle Harry always had an unlit cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And funny that you should remember that about your doctor. And the whole thing worked for him because by the time he was dealing with me, I guess he was in his 50s or maybe even his 60s, and he had this silver hair that went perfectly with that white lab coat. And that's my image of Uncle Harry. Well, I hadn't seen him for many years. When I went to visit him in the hospital, I must have been probably 18 at the time and just beginning university. And as it turned out, it was Uncle Harry's deathbed. He would die a few weeks later. And he spoke to me. Just asked me a couple of questions about what I was doing in my life. And at that point in time, I thought maybe I wanted to be a doctor. And he said, interesting. He said, let me give you 2 pieces of advice. First, whatever you do in your life, make sure you love it. Second, he said, your career, and you're embarking on that process right now, think of it like a river. And you're swimming in this river, and you have a choice. You can go downstream with the current, and the river will twist and it'll turn and it'll take you places you can't possibly imagine. He said you can follow the current in terms of your career and just see where it takes you. Alternatively, you can fix your point. You know in your head where you want your career to go, and that spot may be far upstream. And you can swim in a straight line against the current. And what you're going to find out is you may reach your goal, you may not. But if you reach your goal going against that current, you're probably going to be exhausted. He said, but it's your choice. It was a really interesting metaphor, and it didn't mean anything to me at the time. But I found years later, at every crossroad, when I had a career choice to make, I thought about Uncle Harry's advice. And it triggered 2 things in me. One was how wise it was. And when I look back now on my own career, I generally followed the path for wherever it took me and grabbed opportunities as they came by and continually tried new things in my career, but never anything that I possibly could have imagined when I started. And always something that took me to the most interesting place. So I discovered I did not want to be a doctor because I didn't love it. And once I embarked on the process of becoming a lawyer, I fell in love with tax. Kind of interesting because I never would have expected that when I started. And once I fell in love with tax, though, I never could have anticipated that would have taken me into the film business, and I never could have anticipated that at some point in time I'd be opening an office in a law firm. And I for sure never could have anticipated, because I always said one thing I would never do was lead a law firm. And the only thing after that I was absolutely certain I would never do was write a book. So ironically, I've done all of that, and that's because it seems that's where the current has led me. And it's led me to places not only that I couldn't have imagined, but have left me so excited about the things that I've been able to do. So, getting back to Uncle Harry, the reason I tell this story is because Uncle Harry gave me probably the wisest career advice I've ever received. But he put it in the context of a metaphor that I could understand and that I could connect with, and that my life experience would allow me to reflect upon over and over and over again over the course of my career, to the point where it's now 45 years later and I'm still talking about it, and I'm trying to share it with you. So let's get back to how that applies to speaking. And the point I wanted to make in this first video is that it's so important to connect with your audience, and to connect with them in an emotional way. And Uncle Harry did that for me, and I'm trying to do that for you today. So the thing I want you to take away from this particular blog is that when you're trying to connect with your audience, they may remember the stories that you tell them. They will certainly connect with the emotional feelings that you're able to evoke.